With so many different options and so many different cards out there, sometimes it can be a massive headache trying to put together a 15 card side deck for your local environment or all the way up to a competitive scene like a YCS or higher. So, in today's video, I'm going to be bringing you a very simple breakdown of the different categories you should be looking to at least fulfill when you are building your side deck, depending on the environment you are going to. As you can see before you, I've got a range of cards and I've broken these down into different categories. We've got the board breakers, we've got the tower outs, we've got the floodgates, we've got the negation, the back row hate, the hand traps of the format, and then of course we have a time con option. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through all of these different kind of categories, explain where you would put them in, what you would take out when you're doing it, how they can help you, and the reason that I've broken it down into those 6 categories. If you do enjoy this type of content, then please make sure you smash that like button, hit that notification bell, and subscribe. Getting this video above 50 likes in the first 24 hours will unlock the next part of videos like this, where I will talk about the 15 specific hand traps and side deck cards that are going to be good for the format, and then we'll look into the metas and the underdog decks and everything else in between. So diving head first into this, we're going to talk about board breakers. Now, board breakers, the way I see this is these are cards that can completely clear either the front zone, being the monsters zone, the spell and trap zone, or in the form of evenly matched, pretty much clear an entire board. The reason I technically have Book of Eclipse down here is this is one of these ones where if you don't want your opponent's cards to be destroyed, if they're playing something like Kashtiras, a Book of Eclipse can actually be just as effective as a board breaker to kind of turn that entire board off and then allow you to continue to build with your remaining cards. Not to mention, it's the only one of all of these board breakers that is technically a interruption as well, because this one could be set during your turn and then flipped during your opponent's. So this one is obviously down to personal preference. I've had great success with this. Yes, it does lose to something like Ash Blossom, but the idea of the board breakers is that you're able to kind of take away a section that your opponent has built up. Now, more times than not, your opponent has been building up a board to deal with something like a board breaker by setting up with an Omni Negate, something like a Baron, something like a just generic negate that will stop anything being activated. That being said, that's when you're going to need to combo it off with another category, which is your negators. But that's where we're going to talk about those a little bit later on, and that's where you're going to be building your side deck utilizing board breakers and negators and other cards. You don't want a side deck to all be board breakers, you don't want a side deck to all be floodgates, because you will need to adapt depending on the different matchups around, and you cannot always guarantee to be going first or second. When you look at most of the cards like board breakers, you'll all see specifically these 4 cards here are all cards for going second. You don't ever really want these in your deck when you're going first, because the idea when you're going first is you want to establish your board. You want to build a board, you want to work against board breakers like this, and seeing them in your opening hand can be very detrimental. Which is why Book of Eclipse kind of floats in its own little category, because it can be a very good card to be opening up with, and it can also be a very good card that can be used going second to help you kind of negate a board, interrupt a board, you name it. So with board breakers, what are you taking out? What are you putting in? Well, usually the way that I see this is my board breakers, if I feel they're going to be more successful in breaking a board than a single hand trap, then maybe I'll cut down the numbers of hand traps in my deck. So for example, if I'm playing 3 Ash Blossom, 3 Ghost Bell, and I'm already maining Nibiru, and none of those are going to be effective against my opponent, then I would technically take some of those out and go in with more board breakers. Mainly evenly matched is the first one that I personally go for, just because it deals with both front row and back row. You could arguably consider Nibiru in this kind of section as well, but I feel Nibiru floats between the main deck and of course the side deck, and I do feel that it falls more under the category of hand trap of the format, where one time Nibiru might be absolutely amazing for the format, the next one so many people are playing around it, they actually becomes slightly useless. So continue on with obviously the rest of the board breakers. The idea, like I said, is you kind of want to be going these and going second. It's going to be very difficult for any of these to break a board going first, and that is why it becomes a go second option. So when you're looking at taking out stuff like this, so for example, if you're playing a control build and you're playing a lot of floodgates, like there can only be one, rivalry, goes and match, everything else, then you're going to swap them out for your go second cards that are more effective like board breakers. Another one that could fall under the board breaker category is Harpy's Feather Duster, but I've kind of put that with the back row hate because that is one designated to front row, back row. These are of course designated to front row, and then these are designated to front row or back row. So when I'm referring to front row and back row, just so that everyone is clear, I talk usually front row is your monster zone and the back row is the spell and trap zone. Obviously, I do include the front row being the link monsters. So it's kind of like your offensive lineup and your defensive lineup and everything else like that. So that's pretty much it for the board breakers. Usually with these, if I've got something like Trill Tactics Frost, I'll be putting these down at a minimum. Specifically stuff like Lightning Storm and Evenly Matched, because they're not cards that you want to see multiple of, unless your opponent does have that negate on board, and then you go, okay, great, if you negate the activation of this, I can activate a second one. With something like Darkhold and Raigeki, again, it really comes down to the type of the format and the type of the matchups. A lot of people are trying to play around Lightning Storm by putting their monsters in defense, but the issue, or what makes Lightning Storm so good, is the fact that it does the job of 2 cards in one. So it does the job of Harpy's Feather Duster if you need it to, and it can also do the job of Raigeki in a sense. But then you're looking at budget or cheaper options. Raigeki and Darkhold are very great options for that. And like I said, Raigeki is a card that very few people actually consider or think about. So sometimes when it gets dropped on them, they're not prepared for a Raigeki or a Darkhold. A lot of people do choose to play Darkhold over Raigeki because there are a lot of decks that give you a card to stop you playing something like an Evenly Matched, a Lightning Storm, you name it. So that's it for the board breaker section. I'm going to move on to the next section. So in the next section, just to kind of combo off with board breakers, we'll talk about negators. So with negators, the main 2, in my opinion, that can pretty much stop your opponent responding, you could also consider something like Infinite Impermanence. But the ones that stop your opponent responding, meaning that these, once they are activated, will 99.999% of the time confirm you're going to negate your opponent's board, is of course Dark Ruler No More and Forbidden Droplet. Now, Forbidden Droplet kind of fell out of the format a little bit, purely because it needs to send cards to the graveyard as cost. So if you are facing against Kashtirias, you can't actually activate this if they've got a Rise Heart on the board. Dark Ruler No More is always a hit and miss card because you can't finish your opponent off that turn. They're not going to take any damage. But the idea behind Dark Ruler No More, especially as we move forward into this format, and you will be seeing decks like Infernoble Knights, which are pretty much building, and here is everything I've got on the board. If you negate it, you break it, you're probably going to win type setup. But then you also have other decks like the Manadium that can set up a trap card to negate the Dark Ruler No More, which is why these are never going to be 100% guaranteed, but are 99% guaranteed, because 9 out of 10, if they don't have that card to negate the Dark Ruler, the board is turned off and you're able to continue to build your board, break their board, and then move on. Which is why a combination of something like Dark Ruler No More and Evenly Matched is absolutely devastating, because not only does it stop them negating anything, but it also then stops them being able to negate that Evenly Matched, which is going to blow out their entire board and leave them with 1 card, which hopefully, if you've played your strategy correctly, the remaining 4 cards in your hand will be built to deal with either that front row card or that back row card as well. Like I said, there are other forms of negation that you could consider, but I do feel that these are the best 2 together. You could look at stuff like Forbidden Chalice and, of course, Infinite Impermanence, but I would personally say that if you don't have either one of these, you should definitely be going for Dark Ruler No More, as it is the cheaper option. I then say as soon as the format shifts from being playing D-Shifter or where cards are constantly banished, Forbidden Droplet can then become the next best option. And I would not be surprised if we start seeing this getting more and more play as you get closer and closer to the ban list. Because as soon as Rise Heart goes, there's no deck, in my opinion, that this is incredibly weak against, especially with the Manadiums trying to pull off the Calamity Lock as well, which can be very, very painful and annoying to deal with. So that's it for the negators. Going off of the back of the negators, I'm now going to talk about the tower outs, or the board breakers in a sense as well. So the tower outs, we're going to talk about Winged Dragon of Ra, Lava Golem, and Dogoran. Now you can also consider something like Santa Claus in here as well, but each of these have different kind of requirements. And what I mean by that is Lava Golem is a special summon that does not allow you to normal summon for that turn. So your deck has to be very specific and not rely on its normal summon or not even use a normal summon, something along the lines of Dark Worlds, to utilize Lava Golem. And the way that I see these is when you are building a deck, you answer the question first. Is the format constantly producing 3 or more monsters? If the answer is yes, then Wrath Sphere mode is probably the one you look at first. The second question you then ask is, can I remove the monster once I've given it to my opponent? If the answer is yes, then you go for the Lava Golem or the Wrath Sphere mode. If the answer is no, I cannot remove Wrath Sphere mode because it cannot be targeted and it cannot be destroyed, or it can't be targeted for an attack, then I'm going to have to go for Lava Golem. Do I need my normal summon? No, Lava Golem's perfect. If I need my normal summon and the answer is yes, Kaiju is your next best option. The other difference between all of these as well, considering Sphere mode can't technically be attacked, the kaijus can range in their attack stats, and the lowest you can get it down to is 2200. Now, the reason these are so good, and obviously more have benefits than the other, is if the format is constantly making 3 monsters very, very consistently, then Wrath Sphere mode is going to be the one to go to. If they're constantly putting 2 monsters on the board and you don't need your normal summon, Lava Golem is probably the best all-round option. Now, when you're looking at format stuff like Pearlies and you only need to deal with something like a Rise Heart and you don't mind dealing with a Shangri-La that's locked 2 zones or a Fenrir, then a Kaiju does the job just as much and it doesn't use up your normal summon. Not to mention as well with Dogoran, or specifically a Kaiju, if you do play multiple Kaijus and you open up multiple, you can give your opponent a Kaiju and then summon another one down. Another thing to remember as well with Lava Golem and Dogoran is they are not once per turns, or Kaijus. I keep saying Dogoran because it's the one in front of me, but Kaijus. What that means is if I return that monster from my opponent's board to my hand, I can then use them, again removing an additional 2 monsters or an additional 1 monster in the form of the Kaiju. Another category that Lava Golem comes under is a time con option, because there might be a time where the clock is ticking down pretty quickly. You give your opponent a Lava Golem, you pass to them during a standby phase, they'll burn for 1000, and then if the time gets called there, you will win. So Lava Golem does fit in a couple of categories, but the best thing about these is they all have, in my opinion, fair restrictions. And what I mean by that is the Kaijus are only able to deal with 1 monster. I think that's a fair sacrifice. Lava Golem can deal with double the amount of monsters that Dogoran or Kaijus can deal with, but I can't normal summon. Wrath Sphere mode can deal with 1 more monster than Lava Golem and 2 more monsters than a Kaiju, but I can't target it and I cannot attack it. So it's a lot harder to deal with. However, there are ways to get around it, stuff like Zeus, non-target flipping it face down, non-target bounce, everything else like that. So it really is kind of a format that you need to adapt and depend. And if your local environment does not play high level towers or big strong boss monsters that you need to deal with, you can completely ignore this section. In my opinion, most local environments, most higher up events will require you to play one of these type of cards. And that is why you'll always see a Kaiju come in and out of the format. And then deck dependent, you'll see Wrath Sphere mode and Lava Golem also come in and out of the format. So that's it for your, probably what I would consider these as your god killers. And what I mean by that is usually these are being used to deal with the strongest monster on your opponent's board. Not attack stats wise, just form of interaction, form of interruption, just everything else that it can provide. The next ones we are going to look at in this one is we're going to look at Floodgates. Now, quite like something like Lava Golem and Wrath Sphere mode, Floodgates are in different kind of, they take on different faces. And what I mean by that is Floodgates can be something as easy as a virus card, which is currently being utilized to the max potential. It can also be something as specific as Rivalry of the Warlords, Goes and Match, or There Can Only Be One. We can also go back to the good old-fashioned anti-spell fragrance or skill drain. Now, each of these, again, do play an effect on the deck that you are playing, which is why I feel that most of them have a fair application. Now, obviously, something like Eradicator Virus is not really a fair reflection because it can be so easily accessible and it can't really be stopped unlike the others because they are continuous. If you were to chain to something like Rivalry of the Warlords, Anti-Spell or Skill Drain, you can technically stop them. But with something like Eradicator, you can't. Speaking of which, that would be a very good upgrade for the viruses if they were continuous cards that only lasted 3 turns. So that being said, what you've got to take into account when you're looking at Floodgates for your deck is, number 1, can I play that Floodgate without it negatively affecting my deck? So for example, if I am playing only a warrior-based deck in the form of Infernoble Knights, Rivalry is going to be so much better for me than Goes and Match or There Can Only Be One. You do also need to consider the format you are going to. If you go to a local environment and all 15 players are playing Infernoble Knights, then Rivalry is not going to be the Floodgate for you, and you might want to consider something like Anti-Spell as long as you play it correctly and can play around it. When you're looking at something like Skill Drain, you do need to kind of consider, well, can I play or do I play bigger boss monsters than my opponent? And this is why cards like these are in the side deck and sometimes in the main deck, but more times than not in the side deck, because you can never guarantee that they are going to be effective for you 100% of the time going into game 1. The other downside of Floodgates like this is technically as well, you do want them to go first, more so in the sense of Anti-Spell and Skill Drain. Going second, something like Rivalry, Tikaboo, or Goes and Match can still be very effective in the pure sense that they do allow you to break an opponent's board. And what I mean by that is if my opponent has a Warrior, a Fiend, a zombie and a fairy on the board and I flip rivalry on them, it can technically break that board down to only allowing them to have one monster left. So there's a lot for you to consider when you are building these. So this is again one of those subjective kind of sections of or one of the subjective categories. Can my deck play a Floodgate and not be negatively affected by it? If the answer is no, then you move out of this phase or this kind of category and you look at the time con categories, you look at increasing your back row hate capabilities. You can even add in more hand traps that are more specific for your local environment. If the answer is yes, then in my opinion, you'll definitely be playing 3 that are the most effective against your environment. What I mean by that is, if my deck could play Anti-Spell and Rivalry of the Warlords, but all of my locals play trap decks, then Rivalry is probably going to be a little bit better for you. If I'm going to a local environment and all my opponents are playing spell-heavy decks, but they all play one type, so either all Fiends or all Warriors, then Anti-Spell is probably going to be the better option for you in that example. So that's it for the Floodgates. I'm now going to move on to the back row hate. Now what we mean about back row hate is we mean of cards to pretty much counter the cards I have just shown you in the form of Floodgates. Less so Eradicator because that card's a pain in the backside. But how do we counter decks that are playing multiples of these? Shout out Labyrinths. Well, you always, in my opinion, whether it is in your main deck or side deck, have some form of back row hate. Now, quite like the Floodgates, some of the back row hate will come down to the specific environment, but will also come down to the specific deck that you are playing. What I mean by that is when you look at something like Twin Twisters, Harpy's Feather Duster, and Cosmic Cyclone, there's one big difference between all of these, and that is the fact that these destroy and this banishes. So that it can be one massive difference is if your opponent has graveyard effects for their spells and traps, then of course you're going to want to rather banish it than being able to destroy it and send it to the graveyard. When you look at something like Twin Twister, this has a cost of discarding a card. So can my deck benefit from discarding said card? Sometimes the answer can be yes in the form of a danger deck. Sometimes the answer can be no because you need as much advantage in your hand as possible. If the answer is no, you go for something like Cosmic Cyclone. If the answer is yes, you'll probably go more for something like Twin Twisters because you want to gain as much advantage when you are paying a maintenance cost as possible. The other downside of something like Cosmic Cyclone is if time is a factor and you're putting this in with 3 minutes to go, you kind of want to bet that as soon as you flip this to stop one of your opponent's cards, they're probably going to go a little bit slower than they usually were. So it's definitely something you need to be aware of. However, being able to banish your opponent's back row can be more detrimental, not to mention it can also deal with field spell stuff like the Runic Fountain, you name it. Duster is obviously a single copy, you cannot play more of it at this moment in time, but the fact that it deals with all spells and traps your opponent controls can be very, very devastating, and we have definitely seen that in big events, stuff like Euros, where we got to see Harpy's Feather Duster wipe 5 out from the back row. So back row hate is all about dealing with those spells and traps on either, basically on your opponent's side of the board, being able to chain them as quick play effects to something like Skill Drain, to something like Anti-Spell can be invaluable. Which is why most people will play like 2 Cosmic Cyclone or 2 Twin Twisters and then a Harpy's Feather Duster, or they're going to be playing 3 Cosmics, 3 Twins, and then a Harpy's Feather Duster. Obviously not all 7, because that would be a little bit overkill unless we are in a full-on heavy back row environment. And the reason that these are in the side and not in the main is, again, there are decks out there that just do not play back row at all, or do not play heavy lines of back row that you need to interact with them early on. So you look at stuff like Vanquished Souls. If I'm chaining a Cosmic Cyclone, or if I want to activate Cosmic Cyclone to one of their back rows, 9 times out of 10, it's probably going to be continue, and they're just going to chain that to bring a card back anyway and still get the effect off. You want to be saving these for the Floodgate cards in the form of Skill Drains, Rivalries, you name it. The other benefit of being able to play your quick play stuff like Twin Twisters and Cosmics is if your opponent does set a card and you have this set previously or in that same turn, you then get to activate this during your opponent's end phase and get rid of those trap cards before they can activate them, meaning that if they do have something along the lines of an Eradicator, you can deal with them before they can even flip it and use it. Moving on to the next one, I'm going to talk about the hand traps of the format. Now, what I mean by hand traps of the format is I mean hand traps that come in and out of the side decks. Not going in and out of the main decks more so, but more so in and out of the side decks. Something that's like, okay, cool, this format, every deck that is meta is searching a lot, so Droll and Lockbird is going to go into my side deck. This format, or my local environment, no one plays around the bureau. They're always summoning more than 5 monsters without being able to set up a negate. Nibiru is then the hand trap of the format. My opponent is playing Kashtira's and they're always activating their monster effects before I get to do anything. Well, then the hand trap of the format is Kurakara. My opponent is always banishing stuff from their graveyard, whether it be Dragon Link or maybe even that pesky Rescue Ace. Well, then you're going to be looking at something like Artifact Lancia. Now, I'm not saying these are the exact hand traps of the format. I'm saying that these are hand traps that you will sometimes see all over the place and then the next day completely gone. They're not like Ash Blossom or Ghost Bell, which more so Ash Blossom than Ghost Bell, but 99% of the time you'll see an Ash Blossom in the main deck, something along an Imperm as well. Nibiru is one of the ones that can float in the main and out the main, same for Draw and Lockbird. Depending on your local environment, that's where you might change it. For example, if you're going to your local environment and your local environment is all playing Infernoble Knights and Dark Worlds, well, it might be worth putting Draw and Lockbird in the main. But if you're going to a local environment and your local environment is always setting up an Omni Negate before they even get close to a 5th summon, then Nibiru is probably going to either be in the side deck or cut completely. So that's when you then dictate what kind of side decks you want to be building and what kind of hand traps you want to be using. So for example, right now, my local environment, a lot of decks are searching. So Draw and Lockbird is the first one that goes into my side deck. And then I build off of the back of that. Now, it's not just specific to these 4 hand traps. Like I said, sometimes DD Crow can be the one. Sometimes people put Bestials in their side deck. Sometimes you could be looking at something along the lines of the Phantasme Dragon. Now, the Phantasme Dragon is a card that special summons itself, protects you from targeting by discarding a card, and allows you to draw cards, which is really, really kind of cool, but it's only when your opponent link summons. Now, obviously, in the past where everyone had to link summon, that was a very good hand trap. But now that not everyone has to link summon, it's kind of put to the wayside. So that's it for the hand traps of the format. I'm now going to move into my final option. Now, this is basically a win con. This really comes down to when you see bigger events and the top playing decks, very few of those decks are actually playing win con cards like this because they are winning within the 45-minute time zone. Now, sometimes when you go to a local environment, you might be playing a new deck, your opponent wants to read every single card you play, they might be playing a new deck and you want to win every single card you play. Now, the idea is not to get to time, but the idea is that when you're moving into game 3, if you are looking up at the clock and the clock says, wow, you've got like 5 minutes left, and you know your opponent is going to combo off for 5 of those minutes, if not 4 of those minutes, and they probably play a natural burn card, or they are going to try and play out so you don't get a turn to win the game, that's when you're going to want to look for time con cards. Now, the time con cards I am just putting here for an example is Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood is probably the most generic one. Any deck can play this that it wants to, and then you do have something more specific. So in this example, Infernoble Knights can play Caliburn. If you're a rank 4 deck, you could play Gargoyle Magician. In Vanquish, not Gargoyle Magicians, Gargoyle Cowboy. In Vanquish Souls, they naturally have Borga, and Borga is going to burn you for 1200. In Sword Soul, they naturally have Long One, and that's going to burn you for 1200. And it's just like, well, are we going to go down this route that my opponent goes, reveal Long One, discard a card to summon it, and I go, cool, guess we go on that one. Time gets called, synchro summon off, cool, burn. Or do I go activate Long One's effect, discard, and I go, okay, cool, chain Ghost Bell, Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood, and they go, I can't take this summon back now, so Long One, I guess you gain 1200 life points. I'm going to have to synchro summon this off just to balance the life point difference, and when I do, that synchro monster will then give you life points, and I will then lose some of those life points as well. So this is one of them ones where if you're going to a local environment and you're constantly going to time, not because of your actions, because like I said, and I can't stress this enough, do not deliberately go to time. That is technically cheating, or I believe officially cheating, and that is definitely not something you want to do. Not to mention as well, if you're in game 2 and you haven't even been able to put a win con card into your deck and you're constantly getting to time, you are in trouble. You need to figure out why you're constantly going to time, whether that's because you don't know your opponent's deck or your opponent is constantly asking you about your cards. Then you need to start reassessing how you're going to adapt to it. Especially when there are decks out there that can play Caliburn, they can play Scattershock, they can play their own version of Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood. But again, like I said, you very rarely see this in high ranking decks. You mostly see this at local environment decks purely because it's one of them ones where a environment is the player base is going to be a little bit more casual. They're not going to know every single card off by heart. Whereas when you go to a high level event, more than not, most of those players will have researched all of the decks in the area and know how to play against it because they don't want to go to time. Because as soon as you get to time, it becomes an unknown area where anything can happen. Whereas when you are staying within the remits of the 45-minute time limit, you have the ability to know exactly when you need to scoop a game up, when you need to power through a game, and everything else in between. So that is it for all of the cards that I would declare in the category. Now, obviously, I've named 6 categories, but you would probably use 5 categories to maximize all of your cards at freeze, and then you've got the maximum amount of chance to draw them. So going in reverse, of course, we do have the TimeCon cards. We then have the hand traps of the format. Now, obviously, if there are more than one hand trap of the format, that's when you would take up the space of something like the Floodgate option if you can't play them, or of course, the board breakers or the full-on god killers. So we've got the hand traps of the format, we've got the back row haters, we've got the Floodgate lovers, we've got the god killers, we've got the negators, and then of course we have the full-on board breakers. Now, just as I finish up this video, I'll give you a brief example of what I would currently build with what I have. So, no matter what deck that I was building, and you can apply this factor to any deck you are playing at all. So, in my local environment, I'm constantly being faced down with an Infernoble board that has 2 spell and trap negates, a pop, and possibly a monster negate off the back of the Gearfried. So, my best negator will be something like a Dark Ruler No More. To combo off with my Dark Ruler No More, purely because my opponent has no way to stop this if I negate my opponent's board, I can go for an evenly matched. So straight away, that is 6 cards of my allowed 15. Okay, my opponent is constantly putting 2 very powerful monsters on the board, so I need to be able to break my opponent's board before it even gets finished, or I need to be able to break my opponent's board after it's already been built. So, does my opponent produce a negate before the 5th summon? No. Well, then Nibiru is going to be ideal for me. Do they produce a negate and I'm better off trying to pick that board apart after the fact? Yes. Well, Lava Golem might be the best option because I do not need my normal summon. So for something like this, you're either going to go 3 Nibiru, 3 Lava Golem, or if you feel you need the Floodgate option and you need the TimeCon option, you can go for a 2 instead. Carrying on. Can my deck play a Floodgate? Well, yeah, I'm playing Dark World, so I can very easily be playing free Eradicator. Now, I'm only ever going to put Eradicator into my deck when I'm going first, and when I'm going first, I'm not going to be putting in something like Lava Golem, Evenly Matched, or Dark Ruler. I'm only going to max out on Eradicator because I want to see it as early as I possibly can. So, we'll go with free Eradicator. So at the moment, we are currently sitting on 11 cards. I have 4 more spaces left. Now, I can either max up my Lava Golem or Nibirus and make sure that I've got 3, meaning I've got 3 spaces left, which can be 1 more card. Or, as it currently sits, I can add in 2 more cards that are going to be of 2 ofs each. Well, my local environment can sometimes be quite slow, so I do feel that I'm going to go into time quite a lot, so I might need a TimeCon option in the form of Ghost Sister and Spooky Dogwood. So I'll put this at 2. I then also feel that the current format, a lot of decks are searching. Infernoble Knights, Synchrons can do it as well. So maybe something like a Drawn Lockbird is going to be more effective than anything else. So I can also put that in there at 2, if not 3 as well. Now, if I was to go with a side deck like this, the one big thing that is missing is... That's exactly right, back row hate. So if my opponent was to Floodgate me, I have no way to deal with it. So, when I'm looking at something like that, I need to figure out, well, can any of these go into my main deck? If I can put any of these in my main deck, I open up space for these. So that really comes down to it. Now, if I'm looking at something like this, well, I don't really want Dark Ruler No More in my deck because I could have 3 cards if I'm going first can be completely useless for me. The same argument can be made for Evenly Matched. Arguably, Nibiru is the most flexible one because even if I build a board and my opponent stops it, I can still break theirs after the fact. Ghost Sister is definitely not a card I want in my main deck. It's only one of them ones that I need for a TimeCon option. Eradicator, I can't always guarantee I'm going to be going first, so quite like the opposite of Dark Ruler No More and Evenly Matched, I cannot really get the maximum value out of this, so this one can't go in the main. Now, however, I did say that a lot of my decks at locals were doing a lot of searching, so Drawn Lockbird could in theory go into the main deck, and that would then give me an advantage over my opponent because most are going to expect this in the side deck. So that's kind of a bit of a mini thought process that kind of allows you to figure out how you want to build your side deck. Now, obviously, like I said, as I was building this, if I was like, well, I never go to time, I'm always pretty fast, my local environment is pretty fast, well, then that one, straight away, there you go. I can play a Floodgate, cool, check. I need to break a board, Check. I need to negate a board before I break a board. Check. My opponent can't deal with a lava golem and they're constantly put up 2 on the negates and I don't need my normal summon. Check. The format is currently searching a heck of a lot, so we'll go with the hand trap of the format, draw on Lockbird. Check. I need to make sure I have a way to deal with back row out there. So I can't really utilize Twin Twisters. I don't want to discard a lot of my cards. I need to maintain value. And my half-piece Feather Duster is only a 1-op. So I need to be able to deal with back row Floodgates in case my opponent flips them on me. Cosmic Cyclone, check. So that is just a brief example. Like I said, if you are playing something like Labyrinth, you might want to consider maining skill drain, siding skill drain, you name it. You've got plenty of different options and that's what you need to consider. I hope you have found this video very informative. I tried to go in as much depth as possible and in theory, crack open my brain to show you my thought process of when I'm building a side deck. And always remember this. If you split your cards and your requirements for your side deck into 6 categories, board breakers, back row hate, Floodgates, hand traps of the format, negation, and god killers, you will then be able to build a side deck perfectly fit for your deck. And the next stage is all about what card you take out and what card you put in. The first thing to do with that, and I'll cover this a little bit more in a future video, is the first thing you need to identify is, am I going to go first in game 2 or second in game 2? That will then allow you to go, right, okay, well, I'm going to go first, so I don't want to be putting in evenly matched Dark Ruler and Lava Golem. I want to actually be putting in Eradicator, and my opponent's playing back row, so I'm going to put in Cosmic Cyclone. Nope, they're going to make me go second. Well, I need to break my opponent's board, so I'm going to go with Dark Ruler and Evenly instead. I don't feel that my Ash Blossoms in my main deck are going to be that effective, so I'll take those out. I'm also main decking a Floodgate that's not going to be that effective, so I'm going to take that out as well. Anyway, that is it for building a side deck in 2023. If you did enjoy this video, by all means, please smash that like button. Getting the video above 50 likes in the first 24 hours will unlock another video for you. I'm going to be looking at doing the top meta decks while also discussing the top underdog decks and the top future decks that you need to be wary of as soon as that ban list drops and how much it will shake up a format. I'll also be more than happy to talk to you about specific side deck options, but it really comes down to local environment or the environment you are intended to go to as to how you adapt and what you put together. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share. Till next time, as absolutely always, stay safe and of course, happy dueling.